I was standing in a cemetery in North Carolina, still wearing the black dress I'd put on at 5 in the morning, when my phone buzzed. It wasn't a condolence text. It wasn't a missed call from a relative asking if I needed anything. It was a Facebook notification. Tag. Someone had tagged me in a post. I almost didn't look. I was 3 days into burying my mother. 3 days of funeral home paperwork, flower arrangements I couldn't afford to care about, and a grief so heavy it had stopped feeling like emotion and started feeling like weather. I was standing 6 feet from her grave, waiting for the pastor to finish, and my phone buzzed. I looked. Shannon was in a white blazer. Champagne glass raised. Sunset filter turned up so high the whole image looked like it was on fire. She was standing on the porch. That porch, the one with the hand-painted green railing that Grandpa and I refinished together the summer I turned 19. And the caption read, "Sold. New chapter. Clinking glasses sparkles so grateful for this journey, this family, and what's ahead." 34 comments. 14 heart emojis. Someone wrote, "You deserve this, Queen." I stood at my mother's graveside and stared at that screen for what felt like a very long time. I didn't cry. I'd already used everything I had for the woman we were burying. I didn't call Shannon. I didn't text Derek. I didn't type a single comment. I opened my contacts, scrolled to a name I hadn't used in 14 months, and typed 7 words. "Did you know they sold the cabin?" Robert Calloway, Grandpa's private attorney, a quiet man in his late 60s who wore the same brown blazer every time I'd ever seen him, replied in 4 minutes. "They didn't. Come Monday. I have everything." I put my phone in my pocket. The pastor was still speaking. I looked at my mother's coffin and thought about how she would have handled this, with her jaw tight and her voice completely level. She always said the loudest thing a woman could do was stay calm when everyone expected her to fall apart. So I stayed calm. That was a Friday. I had a long weekend ahead of me and a very specific Monday to get to. This is the story of how my grandfather, a man who built furniture by hand, drove the same truck for 22 years, and never once raised his voice at anyone, made sure that no one could take what was mine. Not even the family who spent years pretending I didn't exist. My name is Claire Whitmore. I'm 34 years old. I've worked as an estate paralegal for 9 years at a mid-size firm in Asheville, North Carolina. I know what probate looks like from the inside. I know what a fraudulent conveyance filing feels like to receive. I know the difference between a will and a trust, between a deed and a title, between someone who legally owns something and someone who simply acts like they do. The irony of what happened to me is not lost on me. I grew up in Vermont, about 40 minutes from the cabin. My grandfather, everyone called him Grandpa Walt, though his name was Walter Edmund Whitmore, built that cabin in 1987 with 2 friends and a lumber budget he'd saved for 3 years. It sat on 4.5 acres outside of Stowe, Vermont. 2 bedrooms. 1 stone fireplace. A covered front porch that faced west, which meant every single evening without fail, the sunset came straight at you like it had been arranged specifically for that porch. I spent every summer of my childhood there. Not visiting, living. My parents divorced when I was 7, and summers at Grandpa Walt's were the one constant that never changed, never got complicated by custody arrangements or new partners or the particular cruelty that adults sometimes direct at each other through their children. At the cabin, none of that existed. There was the porch, the wood smell, the sound of the tree line at night, and Grandpa Walt handing me a paintbrush and telling me to pick a color for the railing. Pick green. We painted it together the summer I was 19. It stayed green until the day it sold, or almost sold. When Grandpa Walt's health started declining in 2018, I was the one who drove up from Asheville. Not every weekend, but close. I organized his medications. I went to his doctor appointments. I fixed the leak under the kitchen sink in February 2019 when it was 11 degrees outside and the plumber couldn't come for 4 days. I sat with him on that porch in the evenings and we didn't always talk. Sometimes we just watched the light change and that was enough. Shannon came for Easter 2019. Derek came for his birthday in June. They brought wine and took photographs and left. I'm not saying this to sound like a martyr. I'm saying it because context matters. Because when someone takes something from you, the why of why it mattered is the part that never makes it into the legal documents. Robert Calloway had been Grandpa Walt's attorney since 1994. Careful man. Private. He sent a handwritten card when Grandpa passed in March 2021. I remember thinking it was an unusual thing to do. Handwritten on cream paper with a single line that said, "Your grandfather was a man of extraordinary foresight. You'll understand that more with time." I filed that card away and didn't think about it again until I was standing in a cemetery 14 months later, staring at a champagne reel on my phone. Let me tell you about Shannon first, because Shannon is the kind of person who requires some setup. Shannon Aldridge, née Whitmore, my father's brother's daughter, is 37 years old and has spent approximately 15 of those years cultivating a personality built entirely around being the most visible person in any room. She does not have a job in the traditional sense. She has a lifestyle brand, 42,000 Instagram followers, a blog she updated consistently for about 8 months in 2021 before quietly abandoning it, a home in suburban Connecticut that her husband Gary pays for, while Shannon describes herself in her bio as an entrepreneur and content creator. Shannon is the kind of person who shows up to family events 45 minutes late and somehow makes it feel like everyone else was early by accident. She and I have never been close. This was not a slow falling out or a dramatic rupture. It was simply the natural result of being fundamentally different people who happened to share a grandfather. Shannon finds competence threatening. I find performance exhausting. We smiled at each other across tables for 30 years and kept a polite, shallow distance. What I did not fully understand until recently was that Shannon had been watching The Cabin for years the way certain people watch things they've decided should eventually belong to them. Not because they love it, but because they believe they deserve it more than whoever has it. The first concrete example of this came in the summer of 2020. Grandpa Walt was still alive but declining. Shannon called me, one of the maybe 4 times she'd called me in the previous decade, to ask if she could use the cabin for a family weekend in August. I wasn't the owner. I had no legal authority to approve or deny anything. But she was calling me because she knew I was the one who managed the property practically, who had the key code, who knew the caretaker, who knew where the fuse box was. I said I'd check with Grandpa Walt. He said it was fine. Shannon brought 11 people. A friend group, not family. They left the stone fireplace full of ash they didn't clean out, broke a porch chair that had been there since 1991, and left a bottle of red wine tipped over on the kitchen counter, dried into the wood by the time the caretaker found it 3 days later. When I mentioned it to Shannon, she said, "Claire, it was an accident. Why do you always have to make things so heavy?" I paid the caretaker's cleaning fee, $60. I didn't ask Shannon to reimburse me. I just made a note of it in the way that you make notes of things you don't yet know you'll need. The second example came in January 2021, about 2 months before Grandpa Walt passed. Shannon called again. This time she wanted to discuss the cabin's future. Her phrasing. She'd apparently spoken to Derek, my other cousin, the older one, quieter but not innocent, and the two of them had decided that when Grandpa passed, the smart financial move would be to list the property. She quoted a Zillow estimate to me, $310,000. She said it didn't make sense to hold on to it emotionally when the market was strong. I asked her if she'd spoken to Grandpa Walt about this. She said, "He's not really in a position to be making those kinds of decisions anymore, Claire. He was. I'd spoken to him the previous Thursday and he'd been entirely lucid, entirely himself, and entirely aware of exactly what he owned and what he wanted done with it. But Shannon had already decided that his preferences were an inconvenience to be managed, rather than a reality to be respected. I didn't argue with her. I said I'd think about it. I hung up and called Robert Calloway's office to leave a message asking if Grandpa Walt had updated his estate documents recently. Calloway's assistant called back and told me Mr. Calloway couldn't discuss client matters but that I shouldn't worry. At the time I thought that was a strange thing to say. The third example is the one that still makes my jaw tighten when I think about it. Grandpa Walt's memorial was held at the cabin in April 2021, 5 weeks after he passed. I organized it, the food, the guest list, the seating, the flowers. I drove up from Asheville 2 days early to prepare. I made his favorite potato soup because I knew his friends would expect it. Shannon arrived an hour before guests and spent the first 20 minutes taking photographs for her Instagram. The fireplace, the porch railing, the green one, the view. She posted during the memorial. During it, I saw her in the corner by the window, phone up, story uploading, while his oldest friend was speaking about the man they were there to remember. She captioned it, "Honoring a legacy. Green heart, some places just hold love forever." 1,400 likes. I didn't say anything that day. I carried dishes back to the kitchen and thought about the word legacy and what it means when someone uses it to describe something they're already planning to sell. My mother's name was Diane. Diane Whitmore, later Diane Marsh after she remarried in 2003. She was 61 years old when her heart gave out on a Tuesday morning in late October. She was making coffee. The paramedics said it was fast. I've spent a lot of time deciding to believe that. She and Grandpa Walt had a complicated relationship. She was his daughter-in-law from a marriage that ended, which put her in that particular no-man's land that divorced parents occupy in extended families. But he respected her. He told me once that she was the kind of person who does what she says she'll do. And coming from Grandpa Walt, that was as high as compliments went. I got the call on a Tuesday. I was at my desk in Asheville, reviewing a probate inventory for a client whose family was fighting over a timeshare in Myrtle Beach. The particular pettiness of grief never gets less strange when you work in estate law. My stepfather called, voice completely flat in the way voices go when someone has already cried everything out before making the call. I drove to Charlotte that evening. I spent Wednesday and Thursday at the funeral home at the florist, on the phone with my mother's friends, inside the specific bureaucratic fog that death generates. Death certificates, obituary wording, casket choices presented by a man in a gray suit who spoke very softly and called everything a selection. Shannon texted me Wednesday evening. Heard about Aunt Diane. So sorry, Claire. Let me know if you need anything, blue heart. I read it. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say to a text like that from a person like Shannon. Performative sympathy delivered at the precise minimum required to feel like she'd shown up. What I did not know on Wednesday, what I had absolutely no reason to suspect, was that while I was choosing flowers for my mother's casket, Shannon and Derek were 40 minutes north of Stowe, sitting in a real estate office, signing a purchase and sale agreement on Grandpa Walt's cabin. I found this out later from Robert Calloway, with the kind of precise timeline that attorneys keep because they understand that details matter. The listing had gone up 11 days earlier. The realtor was a woman named Patty Osgood. Local agent, good reviews. No reason to suspect anything irregular about 2 adult grandchildren listing a family property. The asking price was $340,000. The buyers were a couple from Boston, early 40s, looking for a vacation property. They offered $327,500. Shannon and Derek countered at $335,000. The buyers accepted. The purchase and sale agreement was signed on a Thursday. My mother's funeral was Friday. Let me say that again so it lands the way it landed for me when I learned it. They signed the papers on Thursday. I buried my mother on Friday. Shannon posted the reel on Friday evening, still in her blazer, presumably still in Vermont, 40 minutes from the cabin she had just sold, the day I stood at a graveside. The timing was not an accident. I want to be careful about how I say that, because I can't prove intent in a legal sense. But I know this. They had been watching my calendar. They knew I was in Charlotte. They knew I would be consumed, unreachable, too deep in grief to check property records or make phone calls. They had an 11-day listing window, and they chose the exact 72 hours when they knew I would be at my most unavailable. That is not coincidence. That is calculation. When I finally called Shannon, Sunday evening 2 days after the real, 1 day before I drove to Robert Calloway's office, her voice had the careful steadiness of someone who had rehearsed the conversation. "Claire, I know this is bad timing. Did you list Grandpa's cabin?" Then, Derek and I made a decision about the estate. It's been 2 years. The property has been sitting. Shannon, did you list it? It was always going to be sold eventually. Her tone shifted. Not cruel exactly, but with that particular edge she got when she wanted to reframe a situation to her advantage. You were just too sentimental to see it. Someone had to be practical. Who gave you authority to list it? Another pause. Longer this time. We're family, Claire. We all inherited. Who gave you legal authority? She didn't answer that. What she said instead, and I remember this precisely because I wrote it down the moment I hung up the phone. You were never on the paperwork, Claire. You just like to act like you were. Hung up. I sat in my stepfather's kitchen in Charlotte, on a Sunday night 48 hours after burying my mother, and I thought about that sentence. You were never on the paperwork. She said it like it was the end of something. Like paperwork was the whole story. What Shannon did not know, what neither she nor Derek had any idea about, was that I had spent 9 years working in estate law. And the first thing they teach you, the thing that gets drilled into you so early it becomes instinct, is this. The paperwork you don't know about is usually the paperwork that matters most. I had Robert Calloway's text on my phone. For minutes. They didn't. Come Monday. I have everything. I went to sleep. I let Sunday become Monday. Robert Calloway's office was on a side street in Burlington, Vermont. One of those old New England buildings where the wooden stairs creak and the waiting room still has a bowl of wrapped butterscotch candies on the side table. I'd been there twice before, both times with Grandpa Walt. Once in 2019 for what Grandpa described only as some paperwork. Once in 2020 to witness a document I was told was a routine update. I had not thought about either of those visits in years. I arrived at 9 on Monday morning in the same black dress I'd driven north in, because I hadn't thought to pack anything else when I left Charlotte. Calloway was already at his desk. Brown blazer as always. He shook my hand and did not waste time. He opened a manila folder and slid a document across the desk. Your grandfather established a discretionary trust in March 2019, he said. The Whitmore Family Cabin Trust. He transferred the deed to the property into the trust at the time of filing. The cabin has not been part of his general estate since then. It was never available for distribution to heirs through probate. I looked at the document. The date, March 14, 2019. 2 months after Shannon had first called me to discuss the cabin's future. 2 months after she'd told Grandpa Walt he wasn't in a position to be making those kinds of decisions anymore. He had been listening. He had been watching. And he had acted. Who is named as beneficiary? I asked, even though I already had a feeling I knew. Calloway looked at me over his glasses. You are sole beneficiary. You also hold the successor trustee position, which transferred automatically at his death in March 2021. I had been the legal owner of that cabin for over a year. I simply hadn't known it. Shannon and Derek, I said. What was their standing? None, Calloway said. The word was quiet and final, like a door closing. They had no ownership interest, no trustee authority, and no right to list or sell the property. The deed never passed through probate because it was never part of the probate estate. Any sale they executed was void from inception. Void from inception. I write estate documents for a living. I know what that phrase means. It means the transaction never legally existed. It means the purchase and sale agreement Shannon and Derek signed with the couple from Boston was not a contract for the sale of their property. It was an attempt to sell something they did not own. There is a word for that. Several words, actually. Fraud is the short one. I sat in that chair for a moment and thought about the handwritten card Calloway had sent after Grandpa Walt passed. Your grandfather was a man of extraordinary foresight. You'll understand that more with time. He'd known even then. He'd been waiting for me to come to him. Why didn't you contact me when he passed? Yes. Calloway folded his hands on the desk. Your grandfather's specific instruction was that I make contact only if the property was threatened. His words were. He glanced at a note card on his desk. Don't bother Claire with paperwork unless someone tries to make it her problem. Then make sure she wins. I laughed. It came out of nowhere, sudden and genuine. Because that was Grandpa Walt exactly. Precise, understated, and always about 3 moves ahead of everyone in the room. He had watched Shannon's patterns for years. He had watched her show up to photograph and perform and leave without cleaning the fireplace. He had listened to her on the phone when she called him in January 2021. I found out later that she had called him directly, that she had told him the cabin should be liquidated for the family's benefit. He had been polite. He had said he would think about it. Then he had called Robert Calloway, and he had made sure that there was nothing left for her to liquidate. The trust had one additional clause that Calloway pointed out before I left. If anyone attempted to transfer, list, encumber, or sell the property without the sole beneficiary's written consent, the trust was structured to trigger an automatic fraud referral to the Vermont Attorney General's office. Grandpa Walt had not just protected the cabin. He had built a trap. A quiet, legal, airtight trap, set years in advance, waiting patiently for exactly the kind of move Shannon would eventually make. I thought about the summer I was 19 and he handed me a paintbrush and told me to pick a color. I thought about how he'd seemed so ordinary, so simply a grandfather with a lumber budget and a covered porch. And I thought about the fact that while Shannon was building a lifestyle brand and Derek was enabling from a safe distance, Grandpa Walt was sitting in Robert Calloway's office in his flannel shirt, making sure the person who showed up would be the person who kept the thing worth keeping. Thanked Calloway. I asked him what happened next. He was already reaching for the phone. Here is what I did not do. I did not call Shannon. I did not text Derek. I did not post anything. I did not drive to the cabin and take photographs of the porch railing or the fireplace or the view and write something pointed in the caption. I did not forward the trust documents to the family group chat. I did not call my aunt or my father's cousins or anyone else in the extended family who'd been watching this quietly and deciding where to stand. I did nothing visible. Because I have worked in estate law for 9 years and I know that the most dangerous thing you can do when you have leverage is announce it. What I did instead was go back to the small inn I'd checked into the night before, open my laptop, and begin documenting. I screenshotted Shannon's reel before it could be deleted. The champagne glass, the blazer, the green porch railing, the caption. Timestamp. Saved in 3 places. I pulled the Zillow listing that was still active and saved the full page including the listing agent's name, Patty Osgood, the listed price of $340,000, the property photos, interior shots, the stone fireplace, the kitchen counter where the wine had stained the wood in 2020. I located the MLS number. I saved the buyer's accepted offer price of $335,000 from a document Calloway had obtained through the title company. Built a folder. Organized. Dated. Clean. Then I called Calloway and told him I was ready for him to move. He had already drafted the cease and desist. It went out Monday evening. To Patty Osgood's brokerage, to the title company processing the transaction, and directly to the buyer's real estate attorney. The letter stated clearly that the sellers had no legal authority to convey the property, that the deed was held in trust with a named beneficiary who had not consented to the sale, and that proceeding would expose all parties to liability for participating in a fraudulent transfer. The title company froze the transaction within 2 hours of receiving it. Patty Osgood, to her credit, called Calloway back within the hour. She had no idea. She had taken the listing in good faith, had run a standard title search that had apparently not surfaced the trust, something Calloway noted with the kind of calm professional displeasure that told me he would be following up on that separately. She was cooperative, apologetic, and immediately in contact with the buyers to explain what had happened. The buyers were a couple from Boston named the Hendersons. They had been planning a Vermont vacation home for 3 years. They had a closing date. They had already told their children about it. I felt genuinely bad about the Hendersons, in the way you can feel bad for people who got caught in a mess they had nothing to do with. Shannon called me Tuesday morning at 8:47 a.m. I watched the phone ring. She called again at 9:03. Then Derek called at 9:15, the first time Derek had called me in approximately 2 years. I watched that ring too. At 9:30, a text from Shannon. Claire, I need you to call me back, this is serious. At 9:44. Claire, please. At 10:12, when I still had not responded, something shifted. The calls stopped. The text stopped. I imagine that was the moment their own attorney told them to stop contacting me. By Tuesday afternoon, the sale had formally collapsed. The purchase and sale agreement was voided. The title company issued a formal rescission notice. Patty Osgood removed the listing. The reel disappeared sometime Tuesday morning. I noticed because I still had the screenshot. What Shannon and Derek did not yet fully understand, what would become clear to them over the following weeks, was that the collapse of the sale was not the end of their problem. It was the beginning of it. The Hendersons' attorney sent a letter Thursday of that week. The Hendersons had paid for a home inspection at $650, an attorney review at $1,800, and had broken a lease on a storage unit they'd rented in anticipation of the move. They were seeking reimbursement for costs incurred in reliance on a fraudulent sale, totaling $4,200, from Shannon and Derek personally. That letter was the first of several. Calloway had also filed the fraud referral required by the trust's automatic trigger clause with the Vermont Attorney General's office. That filing does not guarantee prosecution. I want to be honest about that. What it does is create a record. An official, time-stamped, government record, attached to Shannon and Derek's names, documenting an attempt to sell property they did not own. That record does not go away. And separately, quietly, without fanfare, Calloway sent a formal notice to Shannon and Derek's personal attorneys advising them that their clients had made repeated verbal representations of ownership over the property to third parties. He included the Facebook reel. He included the MLS listing. He included the signed purchase agreement. He described it, in precise legal language, as a pattern of misrepresentation. I was back at the inn when he called to walk me through each filing. I was eating a sandwich I'd bought from a gas station because I hadn't thought about food in 2 days. Outside the window it was a gray Vermont afternoon, the kind where the clouds sit low and the tree line looks almost black. I asked Calloway if there was anything else I needed to do. Nothing immediate, he said. The matter is procedurally in motion. I'd suggest you go see your cabin. I finished my sandwich. I drove the 40 minutes to Stowe. I turned onto the gravel road and parked in the same spot I'd been parking since I was 12 years old. I sat in the car for a minute and looked at the front of the cabin, the stone foundation, the covered porch, the green railing. Still green. Still there. I got out of the car, used the key code Grandpa Walt had given me in 2018 and never changed, and went inside. It smelled like pine and old wood and cold air that hadn't been disturbed in a while. I turned on the heat. I found tea bags in the cabinet where they had always been. Grandpa Walt bought the same brand, orange box, for 30 years. I put the kettle on and waited for Tuesday to finish. The family group chat imploded on a Wednesday. I wasn't the one who started it. I want to be clear about that. I had said nothing publicly, posted nothing, forwarded nothing to anyone in the family. The information spread the way information always spreads in families. sideways, through a phone call between two people who couldn't keep it to themselves, then outward in every direction at once. My Aunt Carol, Derek's mother, a woman who had always prided herself on being the family's neutral party while somehow always ending up on the side with the most to gain, called my father's cousin Raymond on Tuesday evening. Raymond told his wife. His wife texted my second cousin Brianna. Brianna put it in the group chat Wednesday morning with a kind of message that is technically a question but is functionally an accusation. Can someone explain what happened with the cabin? I'm hearing things eyes. 47 messages in 2 hours. I read all of them. I contributed none of them. What emerged from those 47 messages was a portrait of Shannon and Derek that the family had apparently been assembling privately for years but had never had a reason to display publicly. Raymond mentioned the 2020 party. He'd heard about the broken chair and the wine stain at the time and said nothing. Someone named Patrice, who I had met exactly once at a Christmas gathering in 2016, said she had always felt the cabin wasn't being talked about honestly. My Uncle Gerald, Shannon's own father, was conspicuously silent for the first 36 messages and then typed, "Shannon is handling this with her attorney." That was the last thing Gerald said in the group chat. Shannon never appeared in it at all. Derek sent me a personal message that Wednesday afternoon. It was 3 sentences long. "Claire, I want you to know I had concerns about how this was handled. Shannon pushed this forward. I should have called you." I read it twice. Then I archived it. Not deleted, archived. In the same folder where I kept the screenshot of the reel and the MLS listing and the timestamp cease and desist. I did not respond to Derek. There was nothing to say to 3 sentences that arrived after the collapse, after the fraud referral, after the Henderson's attorney letter, after 47 family group chat messages. An apology delivered once the damage is already contained is not really an apology. It's a repositioning. By the end of that week, the full financial picture had clarified. The Hendersons' claim for $4,200 in reliance damages was settled. Shannon and Derek's attorney negotiated it to $3,800, paid out within 30 days. I know this because Calloway was kept informed through the title company's records and passed the information to me without editorializing. Patty Osgood's brokerage conducted an internal review of how the title search had failed to surface the trust. That review, Calloway told me, would likely result in a process change at the brokerage level. Patty herself was not sanctioned. She had acted in good faith, but the situation had cost her the commission she'd expected, the professional embarrassment of a collapsed listing, and the kind of story that circulates quietly in small Vermont real estate circles for a long time. The Vermont Attorney General's fraud referral remained open. Calloway told me plainly not to expect a dramatic prosecution. These referrals often result in a warning letter, a record, and a monitoring flag rather than criminal charges, particularly for first-time offenders with no prior history. But the filing existed. Shannon Aldridge and Derek Whitmore now had a government record of an attempted fraudulent property transfer attached to their names. That doesn't expire. Doesn't get deleted like a reel. Shannon's Instagram went quiet for about 3 weeks after the reel disappeared. When she came back, she posted a photograph of a soup she'd made. No caption about new chapters. No champagne. The comments were noticeably sparse. I watched this from a distance the way you watch weather from inside a warm building. Aware of it, not affected by it. What I want to tell you, and this is the part that took me the longest to understand, is that the cabin was never really about the cabin. I mean that in both directions. For Shannon and Derek, it was never about the cabin. It was about the $335,000. It was about a transaction, a commission, a number on a wire transfer, a new chapter, that cost them nothing to start because they had never invested anything in the thing they were selling. They had never fixed a leak in February. They had never sat on that porch in the evenings and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. They had never picked up a paintbrush and chosen green because a 19-year-old girl wanted something to last. For me, it was never just about the cabin either. It was about being seen. It was about the specific, quiet devastation of being the person who shows up, who drives the 400 miles, who organizes the memorial, who makes the potato soup, who sits in the cold with a wrench under a kitchen sink, and being treated, consistently and without acknowledgement, as if that showing up was simply your function rather than your choice. Shannon's line stayed with me for a long time. You were never on the paperwork, Claire. You just like to act like you were. What she meant as a dismissal turned out to be exactly wrong. Because the person who was on the paperwork, the only person as it turned out, was me. Had been me since March 2019. Grandpa Walt had made sure of it quietly, in a lawyer's office in Burlington, 2 months after Shannon called him and told him he wasn't capable of making his own decisions. He was capable. He just didn't announce it. I think about that a lot, the restraint it took to say nothing. To listen to Shannon's January phone call, to hear what she was already planning, and to respond not with confrontation but with a manila folder and a man in a brown blazer who knew exactly what to file and when. That was Grandpa Walt. That was who he was. He built the cabin with his hands and he protected it with his mind, and he left it to the person he trusted to understand the difference between owning something and deserving it. I drove back to Asheville 10 days after the sale collapsed. Before I left, I spent one full evening on the porch. The green railing, the west-facing view, the light coming down through the tree line the way it always has, the way it will keep doing long after any of us have a claim on it. I made his tea. Orange box. Same brand. I sat in the chair closest to the railing and I watched the sun go down, and I thought about the fact that grief and gratitude are not opposites. That you can miss someone completely and feel at the same time, entirely held by what they left behind. That showing up, the real kind, the kind that doesn't photograph well and doesn't get 34 comments, is its own form of documentation. A record that the right people keep, even when you don't know they're keeping it. The cabin needs a new coat of paint on the east wall. I'm going back in the spring. I already know what color.